Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And we're here for the final sessions of the day, starting with a fireside discussion with Professor Michael Clarke, Soft Power in a Hard Power World. We'll start with a short speech from Professor Michael Clarke, and then followed by a discussion with David Haigh on stage. Over to you, Michael.
Soft power in a hard power world. I've thought and written a certain amount about soft and hard power over the years, and the last thing was that I did with Helen Ramscarl called Britain's Persuaders, Soft Power in a Hard World. That's where they got the title from. And looking at soft power, I've always believed that soft power and hard power, they're not a seesaw. If hard power is used, then soft power isn't. They don't go up and down like that as a seesaw. They're part of a spectrum. Power is power. And a lot of the famous writers on power, like Reinhold Niebuhr or Hans Morgenthau, Henry Kissinger, Herbert Butterfield, Martin White, they didn't talk about soft power because they thought they didn't need to. When they were talking about power, you're talking about a relationship between two or more things. And the fact is that hard and soft power tend to go together. Hard power is most efficient when it is somehow surrounded by soft power, when it is legitimized by soft power or consensus, whatever it might be. And soft power is certainly taken more seriously when hard power is not so far away. And so think about the Soviet Union during the Cold War. About a third of the world's population lived under systems inspired by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was much more powerful then than Russia is now, notwithstanding what's happening in Ukraine. And that third of the world that lived under the influence of the Soviet Union recognized the soft power of the Soviet Union. There was a Soviet Union that was involved in the Caribbean, it was involved in Africa, it was involved in the Middle East militarily, it was involved in East Asia in the Vietnam War militarily. Its military was very active in Europe, although it had never had any real intention of attacking Western Europe, but its military was active. The Soviet Union projected its military power. But in those years, lots of students from Africa and Asia went to Russian academies and Russian universities. They learned Russian, they adopted Russian mannerisms, they admired Russia as an anti-colonial power. It's not that the Soviet Union had, as it were, equal amounts of sort of soft and hard power assets, but they had a lot of soft power advantages because they displayed their hard power abilities. So it's not a seesaw, it's a spectrum. And it's not a case of, as people tend to assume, I think, that the military is at one end, that's hard power, and diplomacy at the other end, and culture is soft power. It isn't. I mean, culture can be used as hard power. If a government says we're cancelling the cultural visits, we're not going to allow our orchestra to go to your country, or we're not going to allow your ballet to come to our country, we're not going to attend the World Cup, we're not going to the Asian Games, we're not going to do this, we're not going to allow visas for your students to come here. That's all cultural, but it's being used as hard power, because it's being used to try to compel something, to try to change the behaviour of the opposition. And so, what people think of as soft power assets can be used as hard power. In other words, it's not about the instruments, it's about the intention. And the same goes for the military. The military is a soft power asset most of the time. Most militaries are not fighting most of the time. 90-odd% of the time, they're not fighting. So what are they doing? They're going on visits, they're doing protocol, they're sending bands to play, they're setting up exhibitions, they're going from backwards and forwards. They are in themselves a diplomatic instrument, but more than that, when they fight, if they fight efficiently and successfully, the fact that they do that encourages other militaries to be like them. Other militaries want to imitate them, and this is the fundamental difference between hard and soft power. Hard power is when countries try to manipulate their instruments, whatever they are, whether it's the Bolshoi Ballet or the Russian military. They try to manipulate those instruments to affect the behavior of somebody else. That's hard power. May or may not be efficient, but that's hard power. Soft power doesn't try to manipulate anything. Soft power just is. Soft power is the power of magnetism, not projection, it's magnetism. And the most effective expression of soft power is imitation. So when countries see that Western militaries are really very good, usually, very good at doing what they do, they want to be like them. They want to structure themselves like them. They want to train like them. They want to look like them, because they see that that's the way a good military is. The power of imitation is soft power at its best. So it's not a seesaw, it's a spectrum. It's a relationship. And it's not about instruments, it's about intentions. And we know that the basics of soft power in a society is not what you do, it's what you are. Societies that are popular and are ranked highly in soft power terms usually have certain basic characteristics. One is that they're regarded as stable, they're regarded as law-abiding, they're regarded as prosperous, and they're regarded as a place of opportunity. Those are the things that tend to go together. Law-abiding, stable, prosperous, place of opportunity. And that is created by a mixture of institutions. And it's the institutions of society that is what it is. And so governments can try to promote things, of course they do, and that's reasonable. But what governments can do about soft power is pretty marginal to what soft power really is. Because soft power is what you are as a society. And that is about the institutions. Of course, the institutions are about the people who operate in those institutions. And that's why when Helen and I wrote Britain's Persuaders, we didn't write about the institutions as such, you know, the BBC, the British Council, and all that sort of thing. We could have, and there are lots of good accounts of those sort of things. But we wrote about the sorts of human behaviour that create institutional bases. So we wrote about the persuaders, the boring officials who are really quite good at getting things done internationally, the educators, the entertainers, even the eccentrics, the fact that Britain is a country that sort of celebrates its eccentricity. We are allowed to be an eccentric in Britain. You know, we almost enjoy that sort of thing. The regulators, people who are quite good at regulation. It's a good example. The regulation ISO 9000, International Standards Organization 9000, that's the basic standard of management throughout the world. And it's gone through a few more serials, but that is basically what good management is throughout the world. ISO 9000 began life as British standard 5750, and that standard was arrived at by Britain in 1942 when Britain was fighting for its life in the Second World War, because they recognized they were procuring, the government was procuring from lots and lots of different suppliers, and they realized that they needed to have a standard of good production and management and so on from the people that they were being supplied by. And so they drew up British standards 5750, and that became the ISO 9000, and it's never been improved on. It's been modified to take account of modern things, but it's never been improved on. And that was something, that was British standard setting, which has provided an international standard. And there are example after example after example that you could find of how British soft power, by being what it is, just good at those sorts of things, created an image for Britain. And my final point, really, is that all these are quite reassuring ideas, but they build up to a sobering fact in the modern world. We used to take all of this for granted because the Western world had a sort of a soft power existential quality, partly through its alliances. NATO is the most important alliance of all, of course, very impressive, biggest alliance the world has ever seen. And then there's lots of other arrangements like the G7 or the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, lots of things which derive from the influence of the Western world. But below that, more pervasive than that, is 200 years of Western world predominance in world politics, which has created what I call the paradigm of international society. A sort of a logical sense that this is the way international society ought to be. Sovereign states with sovereign equality, territorial integrity, that we, generally speaking, accepted the internal politics of every state. Unless it was egregiously bad, we accepted every state for what it was. An international system that runs on a population that has grown from about 50 states in 1945, 51 members of the UN, to 193 at the moment. So there's about 200 states in the world, allowing for some of the exceptions. So that population of states has quadrupled since the end of the Second World War, and the Western world paradigm of what the international community ought to look like, a sort of set of standards of thinking and behavior, has been just obvious, existential. That's the biggest example of soft power you can imagine. It's equivalent to sort of papal soft power in the medieval period. Think of the soft power that the Vatican, as it were, engineered or was able to use all through the medieval period. Massive, massive soft power, because it shaped people's expectations of what was and was not possible. Well, the Western world was like that. But now, the Western world has been in severe decline for some time. It happens like bankruptcy, as Hemingway said about bankruptcy. It happens in two ways. First gradually, then suddenly. It's been happening gradually since about 2003 and then 2008, the financial crisis, and it's been happening suddenly since 2022. And so now, although Western countries are still powerful, of course the US is going to be powerful for the rest of this century. Individual countries, Western countries will be powerful and important. Japan will be, Germany will be, Britain might be, in its own way. But the Western world, this idea of this collective Westernism, is probably now gone because we've given up on it ourselves, because of the way we've treated our own institutions. And that's why there is now a battle for the narrative. We never used to have to fight this battle, but there is now a battle for the narrative. My final point, that when I was a student, I was taught at Aberystwyth, when I went to study international politics, that ultimately the truth will out. In history, the truth eventually tends to come out. Maybe not in the lifetime of a perpetrator or somebody who's been extremely brave and courageous that wasn't recognized at the time, but it eventually comes out. Truth will out. And I believe that was true. I learned that, and I thought throughout most of my life it was true. For the last 10 years, I've been convinced increasingly that it isn't true. That modern technology, for all the ubiquity of information, can now have the opposite effect. The truth won't come out. It is possible now, and I think we're seeing it, that different truths, things that are palpably untrue, will be made to be true forever, or for the foreseeable future. And so this Western world, this soft, pervasive soft power that we have appreciated without fully grasping, is now something that we have to promote and battle for. Can't take it for granted anymore, because it's being challenged in several different ways. And the truth, we've got to stick to the truth. But my goodness, the truth won't come out on its own. We've got to rethink the way we understand our own narrative and the narrative we offer to the rest of the world, which is less and less impressed by what we in the West thought was obvious and sensible and right for everybody else. Turns out that it isn't. Thank you.
Okay, well, I suppose you are probably the representative of hard power at our event.
Yeah.
You know more about it than anyone else. In my speech this morning, I said that the UN had helped the world have 80 years of relative peace.
Yeah.
But I consciously put the word relative in there because I'm aware of the fact that in the last 80 years, there have been many, many hot wars all over the place, many of which a lot of people have died in. Are we in a worse, more dangerous position than at any time in the last 80 years? Do you think we're in a worse position in relation to hard power throwing its weight around?
For sure, yeah. I mean, hard and soft power will continue to exist, I think, in the sort of way I've described. They're all part of the same phenomenon. But we're now moving to a world of fragmentation. I mean, you know, the fashionable word is multipolarity. Mm-hmm. And it isn't the case that the sort of Western-dominated world is now going to turn into a Chinese-dominated world. The Chinese don't want to do what the Americans have been doing since the 1940s, is act as world policemen. They don't want to do that. They just want the ability, they don't want the responsibility, they want the ability to do whatever they want when they want to do it. So we're moving to fragmentation, a sort of laws of the jungle. So the Chinese will be like the sort of King Kong gorilla in the jungle. You know, where does he sleep at night? Wherever he damn well wants to. It's that sort of thing.
Right.
And that's what they want, the ability to just do their own thing because they're bigger than everybody else. And so, you know, we have, you know, 4 big powers in the world that create the weather for everybody else. America, China, Russia, and India. And they're big 4 for different reasons, but they are the big 4. And 3 of those 4 are now revisionist powers. They want to change the rules. So China and Russia have been revisionist powers explicitly for the last 20 years. America is now a revisionist power under Trump. They're determined to change the rules. So we're moving to something different. And none of the three, neither Trump nor Putin nor Xi Jinping, like dealing with international organizations. They don't want to deal with NATO or the EU. They want to deal individually with states because they're so much bigger. It's easier for a gorilla to deal with one gazelle than with half a dozen gazelles or 100 gazelles together. That's what they favor, bilateral relations. And that's the world into which we're moving, a fragmented world. But it won't be a world of a Chinese order. It'll just be a world of intense multipolarity.
And with the multipolarity, does that mean we're going to have more armed conflicts?
Yes. I mean, people always ask me, will we go to a third world war? And I say no, because the conditions that united the First and Second World Wars, that made certain powers fight all over the world. In the First World War, it was the empire, the European empires. In the Second World War, it was the ideologies, fascism, Bolshevism, and liberal democracy were fighting, in a sense, an ideological three-cornered war. I don't see those powers, I don't see those factors in the current environment for the foreseeable future. But I do see a future in which there will be more wars. Because, Henry Kissinger said, famously, he said that the problem is not the excess of wickedness, it's the limitations of righteousness. The world is no more or less wicked than it ever was. It's not that there are more wicked states in the world, but the limitations on righteousness. And without the soft power of this Western world paradigm, without this sort of almost unseen mist that descended upon the world in the 20th century, that affected people's expectations of what was and wasn't acceptable and what was and wasn't sensible to do. As that disappears, we have the limitations of righteousness. Who's going to stand up against those forces of destruction?
Without necessarily predicting specific places, are there going to be wars in all four continents over the next 20 years?
Well, I mean, if you look for immediate crises, South China Sea is my number one. In the sense, not so much Taiwan, because there are rules to the Taiwan Strait crisis. Everybody knows the rules, and as long as the Taiwanese stay within those rules, I think that situation will probably not get any worse or any more tense. But there are no rules in the South China Sea. And so China's attempts to colonize the South China Sea by making military bases out of coral atolls that they don't own will go on and is already causing problems. I think the Chinese have been extraordinarily stupid in strategic terms because they want people to be on their side over Taiwan, and yet they're alienating all of their neighbors in the South China Sea by just by this policy of trying to, it's called the 9-dash line, actually taking everything inside the line they created in the 1950s, which had 9 dashes on it, and which includes all of the South China Sea. So they're making enemies of the Philippines and Vietnam and Indonesia and Malaysia when they really need their support. They just don't care what those countries think about them in this respect, in this particular respect of military power. And they were taken to the Law of the Sea court by the Philippines, and they lost on 16 separate counts. They lost every one, legally, and they just ignored it. They don't care.
So the flip side, the flip side of that question is we look as though the world is rearming.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea in absolute terms what that means financially? I mean, how much is going to be spent over the next 20 years by the NATO, Europe, etc.? Everyone is talking about spending money. The Chinese are, probably the Americans will.
Yeah. Well,
it's a reverse dividend.
Yeah, I mean, the arms expenditure used to be about $1 trillion a year. And it's now gone towards $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion a year. And it used to be that the United States spent about half of that $1 trillion and everybody else spent the other half. And that NATO accounted for about 60%, NATO as a whole accounted for about 60% of it, everybody else 40% together. That's now changing. So we're looking at something north of $2 trillion a year, which is, and again, it could go further than that. One of the issues is not so much the amount of cash that's going to go into defence, but the ability of defence companies to produce. Because certainly in the West, the defence industry has consolidated terrifically in the last 30 years. So in Britain, we've got one defence company, British BAE Systems. I mean, and they've taken over everybody else. And BAE, are BAE. They are the giant in Britain. They're our only significant international company, and they are a big international company as well, both in the rest of Europe and in North America. But BAE, I mean, for years, they just didn't believe governments. When governments said we need more of this and more of that, they said, well, fine, it'll take us 10 years to produce what you want, but we'll do it. What they won't do, or haven't done until now, they say, we're not going to build a new factory in Bridgend, and a new factory in Cumbria, and a new factory in Newcastle, when in 3 or 4 years' time, you'll have another defence review, and you'll go back on everything you've said. We're not going to invest, £1 billion for you to come to pull the rug from under us in 4 or 5 years' time. So one of the problems has been that governments have not been believed by industry in Europe when they've said we want to expand production. Now they are being believed, but we've left it very, very late.
But I mean, it does look, if you take a 20-year period, it looks as though there's going to be massive rearmament.
Yeah.
It's hard to see, even though it does stimulate activity, that in the big scale of things, it's going to be good economically. So effectively what we're saying is the loss of soft power and multilateralism is a $1 to $2 trillion loss to the world economy. Is that what you're saying?
It would be. It would be diverted in that way, yeah.
Right.
But soft power assets will also be really, really important, because in this more conflictual world that we're looking at, the attractiveness of societies who look as if they know what they're doing, that are resolute militarily, but also are not subverting their own values, that I think will be an even more important factor. And so the challenge for us in the West is we've got to try to step up to this military challenge, and believe me, it is a pretty considerable military challenge, without subverting what we are. And again, I go back to what I said. Hard power is about trying to make things happen by putting resources in to affect the behavior of another country. In this case, we're putting resources in to try to deter Russia, mainly in our case, from doing X, Y, or Z. But we still want to maintain the attractiveness of being who we are in order to show that we can project power without perverting the essential elements that make us an attractive society that others want to imitate.
But one of the scary things is that technology, the space race, AI, drone technology and so on, is making conventional armies irrelevant. Hybrid warfare, I mean, are they basically going to have to renew everything, and it's going to become far more dangerous than it was before?
Well, yeah, Ukraine is a good example of a battlefield that our grandfathers would have recognised in muddy trenches, and which our 8-year-old sons and daughters recognise in terms of the high-tech stuff. And it goes from space to the trenches. The fact is, the future battlefield will still require some very traditional elements, but the future battlefield will probably look quite deserted for quite a long time, because everything will be going on behind. Deep fires, as it were, warfare behind the area you're both interested in, until there comes a point at which a force will then move in to an area where the other side can't do very much about it. And those behind-the-line stuff will both be destructive kinetic weapons, cyber weapons, subversion, and so on. So 2 or more societies will actually compete over an area in which not much seems to be going on, until one side feels they can walk in without much opposition. That's the sort of thing that's what they're teaching now at British Staff College.
Are we heading for an era of nuclear war?
Not necessarily, but there will be more nuclear proliferation by 2050 for sure. There are 9 nuclear powers at the moment. That's far fewer than we thought. John Kennedy, used to talk about there being 20, 25 nuclear powers by the 1980s, and that hasn't happened. There are 9, but the Iranians are very, very close, and they may cross the threshold. They could choose to cross the threshold whenever they want. Now, they haven't really got a warhead, but they could test. They could get the benefit of becoming a nuclear power by testing. They could do that tomorrow, really, if they wanted to, and so far they don't. But there will be 10, and they'll go in 2s and 3s. So just like India and Pakistan both went nuclear in 1998. India had tested in 74, but in 98, India went, Pakistan went, together. And so if Iran goes, Saudi Arabia will go quite quickly afterwards. Turkey might go quite quickly. So what we'll find is that it'll go in 2 or 3 there, and then nothing for 5 or 6 years, then 2 or 3 more. And we'll go from 9 to, say, 12 to 15 to 18 to 20. So there will be more nuclear proliferation. Will nuclear weapons never be used? No, they will be used. There will be an exchange. At some point, it's logical to assume that. Probably not in Europe, probably. But I don't believe we'll get too far without there being an exchange.
So, we're almost up, actually. And
On that tune,
we're supposed to end on an optimistic note. So I've got to ask you, is there any cause for optimism? I mean, might the UN revive itself and become the world's policeman instead of America or China? Or what? Are we just going to have to reconcile ourselves to this
the United Nations is
dystopian
successful.
world? Yeah,
the UN is successful because it is a fairly faithful reflection of world politics at any given time. That's why it stays in business. What went wrong with the League of Nations is that it tried to be a court that was somehow above its members. And when its members didn't like it, like Japan and Italy and Germany, they left. And the League of Nations became irrelevant. The UN has established this principle of universality. So everyone is in the UN. And if the relations between the major powers are bad, then they'll be bad on the Security Council. If they're good, they'll be good on the Security Council. So the UN is a fairly faithful reflection of world politics. If we got rid of the UN today, tomorrow we'd start to put something together which would end up looking quite like what we've got in the UN. I mean, different in some respects, but it would still look quite like it. And so that's where we are with it. I'm a short-term pessimist because I'm paid to be pessimistic. I'm an analyst, that's my job, but I'm a long-term optimist. I think we can get through this period of insanity and we can get through this period of fragmentation. But we in Britain, we've got to hold on to the crown jewels of our security. We can't talk ourselves up in the world anymore. We've done far too much of that. We should say, what is essential to our security? What are our crown jewels? Identify them, defend them, hold on to them, and stay. I mean, let's think about the society that we are and have faith in ourselves as a liberal, clean, a good, clear, liberal, happy society, which we used to be. We used to be.
So I think the conclusion I draw from all of that is the threat to the world is so big that if we don't invest large amounts of money in soft power, we are going to have to invest large amounts in hard power.
Yeah.
And even then, it is going to be a bad world. So there's almost no alternative other than to invest in soft power and invest in recreating and strengthening these organizations.
In the world in which we are moving now, I think soft power has never been more important because hard power is being used. I mean, power is being used in these militarized ways. And that means that soft power is more important than it's been in my lifetime.
Well, I'm glad we ended on an optimistic note.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.